So I was thinking the other day, right? How do you tell an immigrant it's okay to be an immigrant without actually labeling them as an immigrant? Well, I mean, you could host a 3-hour TED Talk on identity politics and culture integration, and then have a, 2-hour post discussion on why being an immigrant is actually a good thing? Or, I mean, you could just show them George Lopez. Because in reality, nothing says cultural understanding like a man screaming at his children in 2 different languages. Now, of course, let's get something out of the way. George Lopez does sound like the most statistically common Mexican name ever invented, but somehow, it's also one of the most criminally underrated sitcoms of all time. And no, I'm not just talking about the man, because you see George Lopez, the person, he's done it all. He's done stand-up, talk shows, celebrity roasts, somehow
Shark Boy and Lava Girl.
But today, we're talking about his greatest and most overlooked creation, George Lopez, the show. Yes, it's George Lopez, starring George Lopez, created by George Lopez, about, you guessed it, George Lopez. It's basically the Mexican translation of narcissism. So what was the show about? Well, it basically followed George, a manager at an airplane parts factory in LA. You know, trying to balance his life, his sanity, and a family that always seemed personally committed to shortening his lifespan. It's loosely based on his real life, but when I say loosely, I mean it's more like a 70% therapy session for George and 30% sitcom. But now, what made George special? You know, it wasn't just the representation. It was actually how relatable it was. You didn't have to speak telenovela to get it. You just had to have parents who yelled at you in another language. Now for me, I grew up in Canada. I was a Latino growing up in the Great North. Every block smelled different. Some blocks smelled like jerk chicken, others like samosas, maybe maple syrup, maybe all 3 at the same time. But for me, this show hit home because it wasn't just about being Mexican. I'm not Mexican, by the way. It was about being human and constantly explaining to everyone why your lunch smelled different. And I mean, if you were the child of an immigrant, you saw your family in that house. You had the emotionally unavailable dad, the overbearing mom, the chaotic sibling whose GPA is a hate crime. And if you didn't relate to that family somehow, you probably still watched for it.
You want some of the good stuff.
Because let's be honest, Constance Marie had a certain presence, shall we say. She'd walk on screen and suddenly everyone remembered to respect women. In a very aggressive manner, I may add. Half the audience stayed for the plot, and the other half probably stayed because of
some of the good stuff.
I know which one I stayed for. But let's break it down, because every sitcom does have archetypes. In The Office, you had Michael Scott, a man who shouldn't legally be in charge of scissors. In Frasier, you had, Frasier, a man whose midlife crisis was simply being alive. And in George Lopez, you had a variety of characters. You had George, the overworked dad carrying enough unresolved trauma to qualify for a Marvel origin story. You had Benny, his mother, who somehow turned alcoholism into a personality trait and child neglect into a chore. You had
some of the good stuff.
The calm, reasonable wife, who to be honest could have done a lot more but clearly didn't want to. You had Carmen, the teenage rebel whose volume knob came pre-broken from factory. And Max, the lovable son with dyslexia. Because on this show, even the punchlines had learning disabilities. It was chaotic, but you know, every family has chaos. You didn't watch the Lopez family because they're functional. You watched them because they were relatable. They'd argue, they'd yell, but somehow still sit down for dinner together like nothing ever happened. It's either love or collective denial, probably a little bit of both thinking about it now. But I mean, the show worked because it felt real. These people felt real as fuck. Maybe your abuela wasn't as violent as Benny, I'll give you that. But she's definitely thrown a slipper at Mach Speed 2 at least 5 times. It's the kind of family chaos that's either a sitcom or it can easily be filed as a police report, depending on who you ask. Now, one thing that this show did really well was going into subject matter that was a little too dark, but a good dark. There's one episode in particular that I can think of, and that's the Hosni episode. You see, in this episode, you have a Middle Eastern factory worker who gets racially profiled after 9/11. And George, he had to choose between protecting his employee or protecting his job. Now, you gotta remember this was 2003, a time when most sitcoms were still pretending politics didn't exist. America was still tense, angry, and deeply paranoid. And the safest thing you can put on television was a talking dog or like a guy falling off a couch. But George Lopez did not flinch. The show didn't turn this topic into an after-school special. It just showed it, honestly, awkwardly, and with a slight touch of humor. And that's one of the things that made the show different at the time. Other sitcom dads were out here teaching lessons about cleaning your room or telling you to respect your teacher. George, on the other hand, was teaching you about prejudice, about unemployment, and about emotional repression during lunchtime. And the wild part is, it never felt preachy. He'd make a joke, he'd sigh, and then you'd laugh. And then 2 seconds later, you'd be like, wait, did I just learn something deep from a show that starts with Lowrider? So back to the episode. This episode worked because it didn't talk down to you. It didn't make George into a saint or the issue as clear as black and white. It made it human. George wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. He was torn between protecting Hosni and keeping his workers employed. And that's the kind of moral gray area sitcoms usually avoided, like taxes. So the moment George decides to tell Hosni his decision, I'm not going to spoil it to you, Hosni appreciates George because he sees the reality and the truth behind him. He respects George for being honest and even agrees with him and understands his position. And just as you think the show is wrapping up and, the climax has hit, a very serious climax I may add, the show would cut to Benny or something, lighting a cigarette and saying something like, well, hey George, next time, just don't hire a terrorist. And it hit you, and you'd be like, oh wait, yeah, this is still a sitcom. That was kind of dark, but yeah, this is a sitcom. The show was awkward, it was uncomfortable, and a little way too real, but a good way too real. And that's what made it brilliant, because George didn't preach. He stumbled through these moral decisions the way we real people do, clumsily, with sarcasm, and eventually with guilt. In the show, George had a punchline, or a catchphrase, whatever you want to call it, but he'd basically say, and when you heard him say this, you'd believe him. I mean, because you'd know he didn't have anything, but he would still try. He would still push through and keep going, which really was one of the most accurate depictions of adulthood TV had shown at the time. Because you gotta remember, that's what being an adult is. It's pretending you know what you're doing while everything around you slowly catches fire. George didn't fix every problem. He just survived it long enough for the next one to start. And that's what made him real. He wasn't the flawless sitcom dad with the perfect one-liner and the emotional intelligence of a therapist. He was just a dad that was tired, broke, but trying, which is about as close as heroism as most of us ever get. That was the genius of George Lopez. It didn't show you how to win at life. It showed you how to lose with style and a union job. Okay, here we gotta be honest. I mean, George was not flawless. The laugh track sometimes felt like it was borrowed from Friends. Some jokes didn't age well, others didn't age at all. They just kept showing up in different sitcoms wearing new clothes. But honestly, that was part of the charm. George Lopez wasn't trying to reinvent comedy. It was just trying to make it through another work week, just like us. What it lacked in classic episodes like Dinner Party or Stress Relief from The Office, it made up for in raw energy. It's not the kind of show you quote line for line. It's the kind of show you remember because your dad laughed a little too hard at something that was moderately offensive. Now critics, they do love to say George Lopez leaned too hard into Latino stereotypes. But you know who didn't say that? Us, Latinos. Because for once, we weren't background noise. We weren't the maid, the gardener, or the guy yelling in the background of a white person's emotional arc. We were the story. It wasn't mockery, it was a reflection. The yelling, the drama, the unsolicited advice. It wasn't just a stereotype. That was just a Tuesday for us. And the thing is, for a lot of us, that was the first time we saw our families being treated with humor and heart. Not as tragic, not as exotic, just normal. Loud, messy, dramatic, whatever you want to call it, but it was normal. Now on a personal note, before the show, I gotta be honest, I used to get shy about my culture. I'd lower my voice when my parents spoke Spanish in public, like it was some secret language we weren't supposed to use outside the house. I'd even get embarrassed when my mom brought homemade food to school. I mean, everyone else had sandwiches. I had something that required a fork and a whole family history lesson. But after George Lopez, something clicked in me. I stopped cringing when my mom yelled "mijo" in Walmart, because yeah, she calls me mijo while threatening my life, but that's just bilingual for I love you. You see, the show made me realize that being loud, being emotional, and dramatic wasn't embarrassing. It was just efficient communication with just a little extra volume. And that's what the show did right. It didn't explain Latino families, it just was one. It didn't pause to teach a lesson or translate the culture for outsiders. It said, hey, you're welcome to watch, but you're not gonna get subtitles. It showed the family doesn't have to be polished or picture perfect to matter. It can be chaotic, it can be dysfunctional, and 5 decibels above healthy, but still feel like home. George Lopez wasn't trying to make Latinos relatable to everyone else. It was just showing everyone else why we already were. Now, does it work in modern times? Short answer, yes. It still works. It's funny, it can be painfully real, and it's aged better than half of Hollywood sitcoms. It tackled race, trauma, and identity before Twitter made it part of its brand. It showed that being an immigrant family isn't tragic. It can be confusing at times, but it does have better food. And again, sure, the show didn't have a dinner party episode or a stress release episode, but it had something a little different. It had soul. It wasn't perfect, but it was personal. And you gotta remember, that's the whole purpose of a sitcom. They're supposed to be messy mirrors that make us laugh at the chaos we're barely surviving. Great example is Modern Family. One of the things that Modern Family does really well is its relatability. Any person can watch it and see themselves or see a friend or see anybody in that show. George Lopez had this element as well. So what's the legacy for George Lopez? Well, for immigrant kids like me, the show wasn't just TV. It was validation. It told me, hey, you're loud, you're weird, you're exhausting, but you're fine. And in sitcom language, that's a happy ending.